Good morning, everyone. It's Madeline with Together SC. So nice to see you on this chilly January morning. This is our first Zoom call of 2024. Ben and I are thrilled to be with you and have some great panelists to join us on this discussion about nonprofit employee handbooks. Please excuse the extra bandage on my face. I had a little surgery yesterday, and it's just a reminder to everyone to wear sunscreen and go see your dermatologist. Today's topic came up through our CEO listserv. And when the discussion was had about various aspects of employee handbooks, I said, would it be helpful to have a conversation? And then when everyone said yes, then I said, anyone want to help? And Beverly Hutchison was wonderful enough to raise her hand. And then we called in Clay Grayson's team, and Elizabeth Riddle is with us today. So we've got a great group, but let me tell you specifically what we hope to do. I'm going to review the objectives and our panels, introduce our panels, and then we're going to cover why do we need employee handbooks, the process for writing one, what you should include, how do you address issues of cultural sensitivity? And we hope to do all that in the first 30 minutes so that we can dig deeper into benefits and get your input into that. And then we really want to hear what's working for folks and have some Q&A. But I want to make sure that everyone understands that you are not leaving today with a draft handbook. This is going to be a very high-level conversation about what are the objectives and benefits of using an employee handbook and what's the best process for creating one, and to share current practices on benefits. You may leave with more questions than your answers, but we also very much want to encourage you to consult your organization's attorney on what's right for your organization. So reminder while I'm introducing the panel and throughout the presentation, if you will share your name and organization, and if you have specific things you want to make sure we cover today, go on and include those in the chat. Ben's going to help me moderate the chat. And if you have things you want to be sure to share during the benefits part of the conversation, go on and mention those so we can be sure to get to the ideas there. So our panel. Elizabeth Riddle with Grayson Lawfirm. As many of you may know, Clay is a former board member, and his firm have been providing pro bono legal assistance to Together SC and our members pretty much since I got here, right, Clay? I walked in that boardroom, he was leaving, and I said, don't go so far, we need you. And they've been a wonderful consultant partner for us throughout the years. Elizabeth's been with Clay for about 10 years and really does a lot of work in this employee handbook area of expertise and part of their practice. As I said, Beverly was the one that got us started by saying yes. Beverly, welcome. Beverly's been at the D. Norton Child Advocacy Center, first as a volunteer, then as a development director, and now CEO. And you've been CEO, I think, what's it, about 5 years, something? But
thanks. It's actually only been 2.5.
You were interim and then you helped. But yeah. Beverly's a good, they have around 45 employees. And as some of you may know, the benefit legal requirements vary by the size of your organization. So we thought it was nice to have a larger organization. And then Ben Bullock with Together SC, our VP of Operations, who's been with us right at 10 years, will speak to what the requirements and when you're operating with fewer than 15 employees. We actually have 6 employees and lots of wonderful consultant partners. But Elizabeth, quickly, anything that you would say, this is what I love about employee handbook work, and anything about your background that you want to share with our folks?
Well, yeah, I've been practicing employment law since 2006. I've been with Grayson Lawfirm for about 10 years now. And I'm probably, as an employment lawyer, the only one in the group that can say, I love employee handbooks. But, I think they are interesting to look at when I get to review them, because they do give me insight into what's important to an organization. It's really the heartbeat of an organization because it addresses the employees. And those are the people that, are really making the organization run. So it's always nice to get that perspective on an organization.
I think that's an interesting point. This is probably one of the most underappreciated tools and overlooked. And you're so right that it does give a window into the culture you're trying to create, and it is a valuable tool in creating that culture. So, Beverly, will you tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you've been so adamant as a CEO to do this work?
Well, I came from a development background, so managing an organization of 45 employees was outside of my experience. So what I found as I moved into this role is apparently I'm a policy nerd. I like things written down. I like, somebody would say, "What do we do about this?" And I'd say, "I don't know. Let me go read the handbook." So it just became a great guide for me as I began to learn how to manage an organization of this size. But also, to Elizabeth's point, we operate in a very defined culture. We want a specific kind of place for our employees to work. And we continue to refine our employee handbook to make that really evident.
You say you're a policy nerd. I think as CEOs, so many of us don't get into this work of nonprofits because we want to manage people or do policy work. We want to do the work. But once you realize that when you adopt a policy, you're making the decision once, hopefully, instead of every other year with every new
Yes.
board. When you don't adopt policies, when you decide on a case-by-case basis, we quickly all need to become policy nerds. Ben, will you give a little bit of your background and how you've gotten into this? And I know you're going to say the name Reed Lehman.
Yeah, I could not begin any discussion of organizational policy without invoking Reed Lehman. I'm Ben Bullock, and I'm a social worker, and I'm a public administrator, and so my background is that I'm a generalist in nonprofit operations and policy. And like Beverly, I love organizational policy. It's what I studied. It's what I've been eating for breakfast every day for the last 12, 13 years, which is kind of a painful thing to say, 12, 13 years now. But I I got my start in learning more deeply about organizational policy from Reed Lehman, who was executive director of Miracle Hill Ministries for many years and was on our board of directors for a number of years as our governance committee chair. And he introduced me to the Carver model, which we don't fully use at Together SC, but we use a modified version of it that suits us very well. And so when we talk about where these employee handbooks sit in terms of a framework of policies and bylaws, that's all that kind of technical stuff is very fun for me.
Well, and as your CEO, it is wonderful to have a number two who gets into this stuff, especially when I'm not quite as good at Beverly caring about it. I'm been off
a learning project.
Oops, hold on. I hope I didn't mess that up. Okay, there we go. So let's start with Elizabeth. And why do we even need employee handbooks, Elizabeth? I mean, and how long can we go without one? If there's just one or two employees, are we okay operating sort of bit by bit? Tell us legally how to stay out of trouble.
Yeah, well, you might be thinking, the real question to that is, do you legally have to have a handbook? And if all your employees are located in South Carolina, the answer is technically no in many cases. However, the larger an organization you have, the more of a legal need for an employee handbook. And, there are several legal reasons to have an employee handbook at any size. Number one, an employee handbook allows an organization to create rules of play without having to put every employee under a contract. Number two, it creates a standardized framework for treating employees fairly and impartially. And number three, maybe from a legal perspective, this is the most important reason, but it creates a defense when an employee alleges something like discriminatory treatment or retaliatory action against them. When you can point to the policy that you're either following or it's a policy that the employee has violated and causes you to take corrective action.
Those are three good reasons. And I do say as a CEO, it's nice to have a way to make sure you're treating everyone equally. Beverly, what else would you add from the CEO perspective? Why do you feel the need for the employee handbook?
I think Elizabeth named pretty much exactly the reasons I love my employee handbook. It provides that guideline so that you can be equitable across, your organization in treatment of employees. One of the things I did recognize and I wanted to mention is it is a guidebook. These are the rules. And I think we have to remember that there are always exceptions to those rules. But if you don't know what the rules are, you don't know when you're making an exception. So I find it really helpful to guide me in some of those not black-white decisions. Here's the rule. Okay, here's the situation. Likewise, when you run into employee discipline actions, how do we make sure we're doing it from a CEO perspective legally, the way we want to protect our organization? That's our role, is to make sure that we protect the organization as a whole. And so being able to say, yes, we have legal input into our employee handbook, and this is how we operate with our employees. And when they're disciplinary actions, we state these are the options that are available. It just, a lot of transparency there makes me more comfortable when I'm working in those difficult situations that you might find yourself with an employee.
I was waiting for that word, transparency. I think it allows us to be upfront with our team about the contracts we have with them and they have with us, and to talk about things that are sometimes harder to talk about on an individual basis, but to talk about them collectively. And I also want to point out that you said about making exceptions, that they are policies, and when we can make exceptions, when we document the reasons why and such to that. Ben, as the COO and the one who has to implement and manage so much of that, what's your perspective on a handbook?
My perspective is that I think when Madeline just used the word contract, she means in the philosophical sense and
Exactly.
not in the literal sense.
I bet Clay's going, phew, Ben got her.
Yeah, from the operations staff perspective, it's also, there's something about employee satisfaction in this process and keeping employees satisfied, feeling like they have a sense of accomplishment and stake in the organization. And the employee handbook helps set the ground rules for that. You can have an employee handbook that is just here are the rules and here's what you get as an employee of the organization. But it really also has a role in shaping the organization's culture. And I've heard the phrase so many times, culture eats, is it culture eats strategy, or is it culture eats policy for breakfast? But I would say that the policy really has a hand in shaping that culture. And so if you look at it as one of a set of tools to shape the organization's culture, you can really use it to make sure that your staff are happy with their work.
And I would say from employee recruitment and retention, nonprofits aren't known for being able to pay the highest compensation that is well deserved. And oftentimes people come to us not so much because of they're motivated financially, but there are other things they want, life benefits of life and quality and the sense of satisfaction and doing good work. And making sure we meet all those other needs of our employees can be part of what the employee handbook helps us do. Anything else on this one? Elizabeth, any reason to come back to you on this? Anything we need to restate or?
No, I think that's good.
So let's talk about creating that handbook and what's the process. And I think with this one, yeah, I'm going to start, Ben, with you and ask you to talk about why we don't have to write it all at once, and can we write it all at once, and what it means to tackle it incrementally.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little trite at this point for me to say, how do you eat an elephant? Because I've said it like 4 times in our planning meetings for this call. But the answer is one bite at a time. And part of some of my paralysis on this has been looking at the enormousness of the employee handbook and trying to figure out how do we implement this. And the answer has been in a procedural manner. And so we've taken the documents that we have and the templates we've been given and broken them up into smaller chunks that we can run through the various layers of approval that are needed. Some of those chunks need to be approved by the board of directors because they are binding on the board of directors. Some of those chunks need to be reviewed by certain board committees. Some of those chunks just require staff review, but we want to make sure that we have eyes, other professional eyes on it to make sure that we're tailoring it to our needs without, straying into some sort of error. And that takes time. And that's true with any level of board policy and staff policy development, is that it's going to take time to build up anything that you could call a manual or a handbook.
And so I think one of the things that was so great for the way we've tackled it is we did our master table of contents. And then we sort of prioritize what is legally required. What do we need for this organization, the size we are now? What will we need in a few years? And had a multi-year. I mean, you've been tackling this for 5 years.
To my shame.
And we did do governance policies first, and because we had an existing handbook we could live with. So on that, what about you, Beverly? What process have y'all taken over at D Norton?
Well, when I moved into the executive director role 2.5 years ago, we've been in existence for 30 years. There was an existing employee handbook. So, what we did last year, about a year and a half, was to update it. But we updated in the same process that Ben just outlined. We went section by section, read it, what is current, what is obsolete, and then also got input from the rest of the leadership team on things that weren't even in there. Our world has changed a lot since COVID. And so what changes must we address in the employee handbook? What goes there, what goes in policies and procedures. As far as approval process within our organization, the actual, it is designated that the executive director, CEO may change policy. I think the exception there, of course, is what Ben mentioned, which is where there is a tie to the board, where there is a board responsibility, particularly anything in the fiduciary financial realm. You want to make sure that they approve it. But I also operate under the logic that I want my board to be aware and knowledgeable about all those changes, and to, even where it's not a board required approval to make the change, I ask for their affirmation. We reviewed the entire document once it was finished with the board, highlighting the changes that we made, and asked for their affirmation of an acceptance of the document as updated.
Good to know. Good to know. Elizabeth, what are their legal concerns? And I see in the chat box a question about the use of the term handbook versus manual. And I don't know if that's something Ben has taken a step answering there, but you might want to address that. And will you talk about copying and pasting, which we're all so fond of?
Yeah, so are there legal concerns? The short answer is yes, many. And you may be thinking, well, you just said that you're not legally required to have a handbook, and we've hinted at the fact that employee handbooks are not contracts, and that's all true. But if you're going to have an employee handbook, you want to do it the right way. It's better not to have a handbook at all than to have a handbook that either is inapplicable or not being used in the right way. So
let's repeat that. Let's repeat that. Do not put in place a handbook unless you're willing to use it. That's what the copy and paste is about. So many people say, oh, I'm supposed to have one. Copy, paste, check, done. Don't discuss it. Don't take it off the shelf. That is a legal liability, correct, Elizabeth?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So don't get into this work until you're ready to tackle it and make it meaningful and accurate, and then utilize it and keep it updated.
That's right. They're important documents. They implicate federal law, state law, and even we have a lot of local city laws, not here in South Carolina so much, but across the United States. A lot of the bigger cities are putting their own employment laws into place. So,
oh, wow.
if you have employees that live outside of South Carolina, that's something that you definitely need to check, because you may have policies that are only going to apply to those employees living outside of South Carolina.
And in this virtual world, that's more and more often happening.
That's right. Another reason you have to be careful with any employment policy, whether it's in a handbook, whether it's a standalone policy, or whether it's just a practice that's not written down, is that the second you deviate from it, you do potentially run the risk of a discrimination claim. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't deviate from your policy, because that would be nearly impossible. But you do need to be careful in your drafting. If you draft a policy in a way that implies your organization will never deviate from that, and then you do end up deviating from it, it can be viewed with skepticism from a judge or even an arbitrator or mediator. And this comes up a lot with progressive discipline policies. Those are policies where the organization states steps that it's going to take when it disciplines an employee. Like, it'll say, we're going to do a verbal warning first, then a written warning, then a performance improvement plan, and only then termination. And if the policy is written in a way that it doesn't allow any deviation or flexibility, a court could find, well, that's creating a contract, and you're on the hook for breach of contract if you don't follow those steps exactly. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit. But for the record, I don't like progressive discipline policies for that reason.
I would love to add a point there to that. Everything Elizabeth said really emphasizes why I so enjoyed working with my employee attorney. Because they think of all of those things. I mean, I just cannot recommend it enough to find someone that you are comfortable working with who can advise you. Is this what you really mean? If you say this, then these are the things, to guide you through those questions, especially when it comes to, how you state things. And, if you put it in there and you say, this is how we're going to do it every time, that's the way you got to do it every time. But I think it's really so incredibly helpful to have an employee attorney guide you through that process.
For the very example of the word contract and partnership,
Yes.
words that we
Yes.
use sort of, I won't say flippantly, but in a vernacular kind of way that have a very different
Right.
legal meaning when they're in something like this. Elizabeth, is there any issue with the manual versus handbook terminology?
I don't think so. Sometimes organizations, especially the larger organizations, will have both an employee handbook and then a policies and procedures manual. But legally, there's no real difference between those two terms.
So the policies and procedure manual is probably how to write a thank you note, or how to, the sort of things
Right.
like, donor thank you note.
Ways to do the task of the job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I see that
And
Kelly
we're actually
go on. Sorry.
operate with two of those. We do have a policies and procedure manual and an employee handbook today. We are in conversation about the possibility, once we revise both of those documents, of combining them.
Oh.
Just to have everything in one place for employees.
Huh.
It's as we grow larger and have more employees and we have more rules and more procedures and policies, we're just finding it cumbersome to expect employees to know which place to find what thing.
Ben, you had a comment?
Yeah, I recommend that approach, Beverly, because this is one of the things I have found great value in the Carver method, and I know some people like to poo-poo it, but to me, its greatest value is the organizational structure of the policies, to say, okay, here's the framework. Here's how we are organizing all of these various disparate documents, and it gives a definition of what policy is. What is policy that is agreed upon by the board? What is policy that is agreed upon and implemented by the CEO? But in that broader term of policy, even with the employee handbook, the policies are any rules, any written rules that are the organization imposes upon itself. And so, saying that the employee handbook is somehow separate from organizational policy. Ultimately, it's a subset of organizational policy.
Hmm.
Okay.
And it's better to have it kind of in that framework than to have it be separate.
I'm going to push us along because we promised to get to benefits and have a good chunk of time for that. Elizabeth, what legally must we have in our handbooks? And I know it varies by organization size. So can you
That's
give
right.
us an answer to this question?
Okay, well, the number one thing for all nonprofits and really any organization or company that a handbook needs is a disclaimer. If your organization is in South Carolina, you need a disclaimer that complies with South Carolina law. So what is a disclaimer? This is just a simple statement that the employee handbook does not create a contract of employment, and neither the employer nor the employee will be contractually bound to comply with the policies. Now, does this mean that an employee is not required to comply with the policies? No. But generally, it merely means that neither the employer nor the employee can sue each other for breach of contract based on those policies. So under South Carolina law, a disclaimer on an employee handbook or personnel manual has to be in underlined capital letters on the first page of the document and signed by the employee. If it's a standalone policy, it still has to be in underlined capital letters on the first page, but it doesn't have to be signed. So that's normally the first thing I do when someone asks me to review an employee handbook that they found on the internet or that they borrowed from another organization, is to fix the disclaimer. For some reason, a lot of people put the disclaimers in the back. I think probably because it accompanies an acknowledgement that they read the policy. And so they think, well, if an employee's read it all the way through, they get to the last page, that's where they need to sign. But under South Carolina law, it has to be on the first page to take advantage of that law. So yes, there are policies that differ based on organization size. So for organizations with less than 15 employees, nearly all employers have to comply with the South Carolina Payment of Wages Act. That comes into play at 5 employees, and also the Fair Labor Standard Act. Both of those address pay practices. So those kind of policies covering when employees are paid, where they're paid, how they're paid, what deductions are going to be taken from pay, how they do timekeeping, and addressing overtime. I would recommend that all companies have those type of policies regardless of size. There's also a lactation policy under the FLSA that requires employers to give employees breaks to pump. So that's another one I would recommend everyone include. I also recommend everyone have an at-will employment policy. This is where you can state that either party can terminate the employment relationship with or without cause, with or without notice. That's very important. Also not legally required until you get to 15 employees. But I always recommend at any size that an employer include an equal employment opportunity policy, an anti-harassment policy, a non-discrimination policy, and a complaint process for employees to follow if they experience or witness a violation of those policies. I think it's good for morale to have those, even if you're not legally required to have those. Kind of going back to what Ben was saying, it helps with the culture of the organization to have those policies in place. Any employer should also have a workplace injury policy that lets employees know how to report workplace injuries. This is important for workers' compensation insurance reasons. You want to make sure that your insurance provider gets put on notice of those kind of injuries. And there's lots of other policies I would recommend, but those are the top ones for legal reasons. Once you get to 15 to 49 employees, in addition to the EEO policy and the harassment and discrimination policies, you might want to have a disability accommodation policy and even a religious accommodation policy. There's also a South Carolina specific pregnancy accommodation policy. And then when you get to over 50 employees, that's when the Family and Medical Leave Act applies. And this is the law that requires employers to give employees 12 weeks of unpaid leave for medical reasons or childbirth reasons or reasons related to military service.
Excellent. Ben, you wanted to add something?
Well, I want to point out one of the questions. Cheryl's asking, when you say 50 employees, is that full-time, or does that include bodies, or does that include, number of full-time hours or full-time equivalents?
That is a good question, and it's going to be specific to each law. And I believe, I don't know this off the top of my head, but I believe the FMLA is bodies, basically. It's both full-time and part-time.
Okay.
But I would need to look at that law to be sure. But I know that at 15 employees, that's bodies. It's both full-time and part-time for all the discrimination statutes to apply. And I believe it's the same for the FMLA.
So the safer approach would be to say number of people rather than, whether they're full-time or part-time.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely check with your lawyer if you're potentially at that threshold, because the FMLA is a big law. It's hard to comply with. There's a lot of requirements. So you don't necessarily want to have to comply with it if you don't, but if you do meet that threshold, then it's important to get it right. It requires that you have a specific notice either handed to employees upon hire or put in the handbook. And the best practice is to put that notice in the handbook, because then you make sure that employees get it. But that's an important question. So if you're on that threshold, if you're right on the brink, you definitely need to ask your lawyer.
And if you're on that threshold, hopefully you have a human resources expert on your team as well. That's, manage it. There's some more questions, but I want to just finish the planned content, and then we'll come back and literally go through the chat box because there's so many questions. Cultural sensitivity. Beverly, I think you were going to share your experience on this one to get us started.
I will. So I mentioned earlier that we recently did an overhaul of our employee handbook. And part of what we were sensitive to in doing that was a report from an audit that we had done on several of our policies, procedures, documents within Norton around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we got some very specific recommendations on things to change as we were revising these. And one of them had to do with gender references, how to make all of our documents very approachable from a cultural sensitivity perspective. So literally, when we went through our employee handbook recently, we looked at every use of a pronoun, and basically we eliminated them all. We chose, I think there are a number of ways you can do it, and I know Elizabeth and Clay had some ideas on this too. We used either the employee, the staff member in place of pronouns. When we felt a pronoun was necessary, we went to the plural. We used they, but really trying to make all of our, and we will do that again when we approach the policies and procedures, of trying to make them culturally aware, culturally sensitive. And I think the easiest way to do that is just to remove a lot of the pronouns. Excellent.
Elizabeth, you want to add anything on that?
Well, Beverly is, she does it exactly the way that we recommend. And another place sometimes that you see in employee handbooks is the word chairman. We also
chair.
Yeah, I like that.
So quickly, let's talk a bit about benefits. And Ben, if you'll start curating the chat box, let me start with Beverly on this one. And Beverly, as you put together your handbook, what policies, what benefits have been particularly important to you and your team, and where are you seeing some opportunities for innovation and just some things that you're seeing that are working for y'all?
Sure. You mentioned at the beginning, a lot of times in the nonprofit world, the monetary compensation is not, on par with what you can earn in the for-profit world. So how do we as nonprofit leaders use other resources we have to compensate our very hardworking employees who are out there changing the world every day? And a couple of places that we found a lot of benefit to our employees is holidays. And holidays, paid time off. And then just in the last year, we have implemented a family leave policy, a medical leave policy, and a bereavement leave policy. That was something we heard loud and clear from our team that they really wanted something there that they could rely on. And we felt like with the implementation of the family leave policy in particular, 99.9% of our staff are female. The majority of them are young females, said this was really important to them. And we see it as a retention tool that we were able to implement this and hopefully be able to retain more of those working moms when they return to the workplace. And I can talk all day about this, so I'm gonna hit a pause button just
So
I mean,
let me just say-
just last week we added 2 more paid holidays based on a request from our internal DEI committee. They wanted us to consider Juneteenth. It's not a state holiday. How do you decide that? We went through that process. We have paid time off, so we don't have sick leave and holiday leave. We just have days of leave that are accrued per pay period, and it depends on how many years you've been with the organization. All of that is clearly stated in our employee handbook, how it is accrued, as well as the number of years, your tenure and the number of days you get.
So just to confirm, you have paid
It's nodding.
Yeah, but you have paid holidays, then you use a PTO, and then you have a leave policies, various
Yeah.
leave policies. Do you have a
Right.
sabbatical policy?
We do not. I think that's an interesting concept, but we do
Okay.
not.
Ben, do you want to share what your thoughts on these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think important to include in there is what is your day-to-day work schedule. How flexible are you on that? Like, can some employees, particularly employees who have children or young children, and they need to go pick their kids up from school, can they start their day at 7:30 in the morning and end it by 3:30 in the afternoon? Other folks who may be more of the night owl type, can they start their day at like 10 or 11 and end their day at 6 or 7, depending? And that, of course, depends on your organization's mission and how flexible you can be within the bounds of that mission. Work from home. That got real big in the pandemic, and now we're starting to see trending back to the way things were before. But some people really like work from home, and if you've got the flexibility, that may be a benefit for them if they don't have to come into the office every day and they can do their work from home. These are all things to consider as a part of your workplace policies.
So Elizabeth, it's maybe if you're all virtual or you're all in person, it may be pretty easy to write these policies. But what happens when some people have to be there to open the doors and serve the clients? Some people that can be working from home on administrative thing. How do you, anything concerns about legally treating everyone the same and the guidelines there?
Yes, it gets very difficult. I think what a lot of people saw during the pandemic is that people were capable from working from home. And so I did see a lot of increases in requests for those kind of policies. And, you can really get detailed in those policies if you want to. It's helpful to delineate the work hours, the work expectations, what the organization is going to provide as far as equipment and supplies, and what the employee is responsible for. We even have agreements that we have employees sign so that they know that they're responsible for certain things, and also addressing, what happens if they have an injury at their home while they're working. But it is difficult because what comes into play here is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which if you have 15 employees or more, that law is going to apply to you. And that can come into play with remote work policy because an employee who normally works in the office may request to work from home to accommodate some kind of medical issue that they're having. So it is a little bit of a tricky balance.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start through the questions, Ben, and see, and I see Robin from Kaminsky House said she's interested in learning more about probationary periods and maternity leave policies. Beverly, do you use a probationary period?
We do. We have a 90-day probationary period, and it's a great question. And one of the things that I'm finding is this is not a, oh, we wrote a policy, we wrote a handbook and we can put it on the shelf. I am having to look at it every day and add, change, edit, modify, announce it to the staff. And speaking to the probationary, we have in our handbook that a stated probationary period, and there's some language around that. But we also have a hybrid policy, much like Elizabeth was just talking about. And, there are many challenges with that. And one of the things that we are considering is, should we make that part of our probationary period, that you're not allowed yet to do a hybrid schedule because you really need to be in the office and learn the culture and learn the people. So that's probably something we're going to be looking at again, but there is an actual paragraph about the probationary period in our employee handbook. The other was around parental leave. We just did implement that one. We talked about what we were comfortable with was from an organizational perspective, financially. We had always operated under the guidelines of FMLA, although we were not required. We have always allowed that 12-week protected unpaid leave. What we were able to do this time was 8 weeks of paid leave. We continue to hold that 12-week unpaid leave, that 12-week period, but 8 weeks of it now is paid, 4 weeks is not. Most all of our staff have enough PTO after 3 years to fill out 12 weeks of being able to be paid the entire time you're on leave. So that 8 weeks paid was determined by the consideration of what PTO we allow and advice from our attorney.
That's a good way to do it. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on probationary periods?
Yeah, so there's two things to be aware of with probationary periods. Number one is sometimes employers tie the benefits to the probation period ending. And if it's something like PTO, that's perfectly fine. If it's something like retirement benefits or health insurance, you want to check with your broker and make sure that that complies with your policy.
Ben, would you like to speak to that with your head?
We had to change our probationary period for this very reason, because when I started here, it was 90 days. And when we switched to our current health insurance plan, the broker said, oh, wait, your benefits have to begin first of the month after 60 days. And, if we did that for health insurance and then still had a 90-day period for other things, it would get very confusing. So we've set all of it to first of the month after 60 days.
And Ben, do you want to mention that the health insurance we use is our AHP that others may be using?
Oh, I thought everyone knew about that already, but yes, we have an association health plan. And if that's something you're interested in learning more about, we've got resources about it.
And if you're already using it, you need to be paid at that 60 days if you haven't paid attention to that. Yeah. So
thing to be careful with probationary periods, and that's sometimes what employers care more about with those is just making sure that the performance is going to be up to their standards. And so sometimes they'll do a performance review, sometimes they won't, but either way, you want your policy drafted in a way so that it doesn't create the expectation that once an employee completes that probationary period and they're kept on, that doesn't mean they're going to be kept on forever necessarily. So you want to state in your policy that an employee is still employed at will, whether they're in the probationary period or whether they're outside of their probationary period. They can still be terminated at any time without notice or cause.
Excellent.
And that part of the language in our employee handbook speaks exactly to what Elizabeth was highlighting. It talks about what happens at the end of the 90 days. There is an evaluation. It's part of our HR system. And we also have a statement reminding everyone that we live in South Carolina and employment is at will.
So Elizabeth, I see a couple of questions about small nonprofits and I think you talked about the legal requirements, but at what size would you start putting all this into a handbook manual versus just having the 3 or 4 policies? Would you combine them all from day one and just limit it to those legal policies and then build the others as you needed them with more employees, or just how would you handle it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would put them all in one. And the reason is because then you get that one disclaimer that covers all of them. You have the employee sign the one document on their date of hire, and you keep a copy of that signed disclaimer in their personnel file. And then, you know, as you grow and as you change the handbook, it is really important to make sure you're distributing it in the right way. I get a lot of questions about this, and it's always a little bit hard to address because people don't want to print. You know, we're trying to be more aware of our environment and not using resources. And so, you know, people ask me, well, do we really have to reprint it and have them sign every time we change the handbook? And the answer is not necessarily, but your handbook is only going to do you as much good as your employees are aware of it. So you do want to at least print that disclaimer, make it very clear where they can find the policy, what the change is, and have them sign acknowledging that they were put on notice of that change, and keep that. I would keep a hard copy of that signature.
Oh, Elizabeth, what about using DocuSign or some kind of online signing apparatus?
Yeah, that's okay. You know, as long as it's something that has a well-established procedure for authenticating the signature, where you can track and make sure the signature there is actually the person who got it. It's okay to use DocuSign. You know, obviously, I would prefer that everybody just, you know, get a PDF signature that they can print or something like that. But
well, and maybe as important, if not legally required, is the session where you sit down and you review it together and you document that the session was had and who was in attendance and how long you were there, kind of thing.
Be very helpful.
But what I'm hearing you say is, even if we're one-person shops, as soon as we start thinking about hiring that second employee, we better start with that bare bones employee manual, you know, and getting the legal stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you're under 5 employees, maybe not so much, but on the other hand, if you're under 5 employees, it really isn't that hard to put those bare bones policies that are in place that can really help with in the employee culture and employee morale.
I think this question's already been answered, but I just want to confirm. If your employees live outside of the geography in which the employer's office is, the laws of the residence where they live, is that comes into play? I think I heard you say that earlier.
Yeah, that's tricky. Sometimes it's the law where the organization is. Sometimes it's the law where the employee lives. So
that's where the legal review with your attorney is key, and knowing where all your people live.
Correct.
So here's a good one, and Beverly, I'm going to start with you on this one. How do you determine if something should be in that policy procedure manual or the handbook? And then we talked about, the question goes on about the relationship between the two, but I think what we're hearing is people are saying, you know, pulling them together more. But how do you? So maybe it's the policy procedure section of your handbook. How do you determine?
Yeah, I'm laughing because I've had this very conversation with my director of operations when we just did our employee handbook, and as we are looking to revise our policies and procedures, it's hard. It's hard, you know. So I think when we started the conversation, we talked about, you know, it's really about, does it impact the employee in the workplace, and their, and I'm not going to articulate this very well because I'm trying to think of a good example of where we decided, oh, this is the issue, and we put it here and not there. And I would defer to Elizabeth or Ben if y'all have a good example. It is a conflict, and there were decisions that had to be made. I think that's one of the reasons that we will probably move to having it all together, because it actually both of those documents guide how an employee acts in the workplace. Some of it maybe was where will the employee look for it? You know, we know our staff. If it is something that pertains to me as an employee, like my PTO or how I get paid or what's, you know, those types of things, we left it in the employee handbook. If it's how we do the work that we do with children and families, it tends to be more in the policies and procedures. So we sort of started taking the employees' viewpoint and say, where would, as an employee of D Norton, where would I go look for this information I want? And hopefully, you know, trying to make it accessible, because somebody else has already said it's only as good as how much your employees use it. And I can't tell you, and I'm sure every person on this call has more emails about what's our policy about this or what's our procedure about that than actually going back to look in the already written document. It's easier to email somebody and say, what's the rule, than it is to go look up.
Elizabeth, Ben, do you want to add anything?
The clients that I have that have a separate policy and procedures manual, the reason why they do is because either the policy and procedures manual only applies to one department or one category of employees, and so they don't necessarily want all employees to have the manual just because it would be confusing, or they change the policies and procedures manual more frequently, and so they don't necessarily want to be on the hook for distributing the entire employee handbook every time they change the policies and procedures.
So that makes sense. Sort of the ones that are department specific might be pulled out and done separately, but the ones that apply to everyone should be in the handbook. Ben, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, we're smaller, so we don't have some of those issues that Elizabeth just mentioned. And so trying to find that balance in there in terms of our need to keep documents in one central place. And so we're treating our employee handbook as a subset of policies in the broader staff policy manual. That disclaimer page is going to be policy number 1 in that that section. And so, you know, it'll be, if you were to print out that section by itself, it would be the first page. And so when we get to the point where we're having staff sign that, you know, we'll just present that section as what they would be signing on. And so that way it's a little bit of both, but we've got it sort of within the larger framework of overall organizational policy.
Okay, I got to push this. We got 7 minutes more, and I got a lot more questions, guys. So let me run through these a little more. There's one about employees living in North Carolina. I think we answered that. There was a request to repeat the disclaimer phrase, Elizabeth. I don't know if you want to just type it in the chat box or cut and paste it, or we can send that out. Follow up. Someone says that their employees have been asked to sign the handbook electronically, but that it's at the end of the book. And is that a problem, Elizabeth?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Needs to be on the first page. And honestly, it doesn't look that great to have it on the cover page, but that's what I would do.
So can you put it on the first page and then have them sign at the end? Or does it have to be signed on the first page?
To be signed on the first page. And so sometimes when I'm drafting these in the electronic version of the document, I'll just make 2 versions of the same disclaimer so that you can just tear off the first page and keep that copy in the personnel file. And then they just sign it in duplicate, and they keep, you know, the handbook together. They keep that themselves. But you
so they have a copy that they signed. And you could also put at the end a reminder to go sign it. So if you're looking for proof that they've gone all the way through it, there could be at the end, now go sign it at the front. And
That's
you know,
right.
something like that. We had the question about what's the rule around signing annually or when updated? And is it when updated, or do they need to sign it annually?
There's no rule that requires to sign annually. It wouldn't be a bad thing to put into place. I mean, I think that's a great way to have employees go back and review these and, you know, maybe address issues or questions or changes that have come up. But there's no legal requirement to have them sign annually. I do think it would be a great idea to have them sign every time it's changed.
But that may be reason to not do one-off changes, but maybe quarterly bring in 3 or 4 changes at a time or something, particularly things that you're going to change how you operate. I find it's helpful to change how I operate at the beginning of a new fiscal year or the 6 halfway point or something that just, so that may be so when the changes are accumulated and done that way. When you say 50, is it full-time or part-time? I think you answered it. It depends on the rules, and we need to go back to that. Here's a question.
It's a little bit more complicated. It's actually an employee's counted for each working day during 20 or more calendar week preceding calendar year. So you got to look at this year and last year. It doesn't matter if they're full-time or part-time.
Oh, gosh. So are there other agencies who offer something like FMLA? I think you mean for groups that are smaller than 15 employees. And I think, Beverly, you spoke to this and said, hey, I'm going to offer it where I can, even though I'm not legally required to because of the size of my organization. In terms of anything on that, am I interrupting anything? Okay, in terms of the employees, do they have to be at one location, or can you have staff in multiple locations and still meet that 50-person requirement? Beverly, you have multiple locations.
We do, and I really am going to defer to Elizabeth, but we're one organization who operate in 2 locations. So all of our policies and procedures are for the entire organization, no matter where you're working.
So it gets very complicated. It's actually 50 or more employees who work within a 75-mile radius of the work site. So what I would say is, if you're anywhere around 50, you need to talk to your lawyer.
I would agree with Elizabeth. And we're approaching that. We're at about 43, 45. So I'm very aware of that threshold.
Oh dear, I think we've lost Madeline.
It sort of looked like it, didn't it?
Nope, there she is. Okay.
Sorry about that. I had to reboot. So, I lost internet. Ben, can you pick up the chat? Because I seem to have lost that too. Am I still sharing the screen?
I think a discussion on PTO might be helpful. Folks have asked a number of questions about that, and I think for me as the operations person, the important thing to remember about PTO is that it's an accrued liability to the organization. When you are doing your accounting, whatever PTO balances and the value of those balances relative to each employee's pay rate, that number, that payout number that you are liable to if the employee leaves under your stated organizational policy, that has to be booked as a liability on your balance sheet. And there's an attraction to unlimited PTO policies, because the idea is that an unlimited PTO policy means that you don't have to keep that liability on your balance sheet. But remember, in the context of that, if it's unlimited, the question is are your staff still reasonably able to take that PTO? There have been studies that have shown that when companies implement unlimited PTO policies, staff members actually take less time off. And then the question of the carryover has come up in the chat box, and your how much PTO can staff carry over from one year onto the next. That also factors into what liability you're recording on the balance sheet. Any thoughts from Beverly and Elizabeth on that?
Yeah, and another key thing to keep in mind about PTO, that's one policy you definitely want to put in writing, is whether you pay it out upon termination of employment. You're not legally required to, if you put in writing in your policy that the organization does not pay it out upon termination. But if you don't put that in writing, the default is going to be that you have to pay it out.
Ben, I see that Communities and Schools has recently added a sabbatical policy. I know we didn't talk about that on the session, and we're at 10 o'clock. So quickly, sort of some follow-up things here. We'll go through the questions and see what else there is that we can answer. But maybe we will try and share sabbatical policies and the CEO listserv, because we do have 2 or 3 groups that we know that have put that in place. And just a quick reminder to everyone that if you're not on the CEO listserv, join, because that's where these conversations are happening. If you're not a CEO, join your peer network, the operations listserv, development. Also, we'll be having gatherings at the summit to continue some of these conversations. And don't forget that some of your member benefits can really help you in the benefits department, healthcare and such. And with that, I want to thank our panelists and Beverly, Ben, Elizabeth, y'all were fantastic. And I want to apologize for the little snafus that just happened there at the end. And I think Ben and I are glad to stay on for a while. We'll quit the recording, but we'll stay on and answer any additional questions. But thank you all for being here, and stay warm this weekend. Hope to see you at the summit.